Across the videos on my channel, I've covered several armed conflicts, from the Russian conflict in Chechnya, to the Tibetan Revolution, to the Korean War, to the Indo-Pakistani split, and the military conflicts that arose as a result of that split. All of these conflicts played pivotal roles in the backgrounds of the incidents that I covered in these aforementioned videos. However, none of these conflicts were the central focus of the stories. Although I suppose you could argue that the events at the Dubrovka theater did actually influence the Russian military's actions in the Chechen conflict directly, although at that point, Chechnya had been formally annexed by Russia. Anyways, the reason that I haven't yet covered a story directly involving an armed conflict is twofold. First, YouTube up until recently has been very strict about these topics, and no content creator on this platform wants to spend many hours of their time making a video that ends up getting demonetized, and as a result, stunting the video's reach, essentially causing the video to disappear from the algorithm entirely. I mean, just glancing at these graphs, you can see the exact point where this video got demonetized. The other reason I've avoided topics directly involving armed conflicts in the past is due to the many intricacies of war, as both opposing sides in every war throughout history have believed that they were the good guys and the opposition were the bad guys. Although due to the brutal nature of war, the reality is far less black and white and is more akin to shades of gray. An understanding of this concept is crucial when retrospectively analyzing these stories, as, without doing so, history is doomed to repeat itself. As this intro has heavily implied, this story does indeed directly involve an armed conflict, and so I will do my best to succinctly recap the events and the conflict, a conflict many of my viewers are probably at least passingly familiar with, the Gulf War, and the major events that led up to the topic of today's video, a scene of widespread destruction on a stretch of highway in the barren desert on the border of the nations of Iraq and Kuwait on Highway 80, which would earn the infamous moniker of the Highway of Death. In the year 1988, the country of Iraq signed a ceasefire with the neighboring country of Iran after having been embroiled in the Iran-Iraq War since 1980. While Iraq had been covertly supported by the United States during this conflict, following the signing of the ceasefire, Iraq's economy was in shambles as the country was deeply in debt, with its two biggest debts owed to its ally Saudi Arabia and the neighboring country of Kuwait. As the effects of this debt began to negatively reflect on the living conditions of the populace of Iraq, tensions within Iraq began to arise. Feeling the pressures from the increasingly agitated public, Iraq's leadership sent envoys to meet with both Saudi officials and Kuwaiti officials to plead for them to forgive their debts. However, these pleas would ultimately fall on deaf ears, as both nations refused to clear Iraq's outstanding debts owed to them. Notably, the meeting with Kuwait, to which Iraq owed approximately $14 billion, had gone particularly poorly, as Kuwait's emir allegedly laughed at the Iraqi ambassador following his proposal and further stated that he wished to, quote, turn every Iraqi woman into a $10 prostitute, although whether this alleged interaction really happened as such is ultimately unknown. But, needless to say, the meeting nonetheless increased the tensions between Iraq and Kuwait significantly. With forgiveness for their debts off the table for Iraq, leadership within the country began to become increasingly hostile towards Kuwait, as it accused both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia of exceeding their yearly crude oil outputs, which had driven the cost of oil down from $18 a barrel to around $10 a barrel, which hampered Iraq's economy as the export of oil was one of the country's main sources of income. And so, over the following 2 years, Iraq would continue to lash out at Kuwait publicly and began to position tens of thousands of troops along the border with Kuwait, seemingly in preparation to invade the country. Behind the scenes, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein attempted to broker deals with both Saudi Arabia and the United States, amongst other countries, for their direct support in an incursion of Kuwait, or at least for their non-involvement should they attempt it alone. In July of 1990, Iraq openly threatened to invade Kuwait, claiming that Kuwait held territory, the oil-rich region of Rumaila, which rightfully belonged to them. These claims stemmed all the way back to World War I, as Kuwait had been held by the Ottoman Empire as the province of Basra preceding World War I, which Iraq claimed made Rumaila rightfully their territory. Along with these threats, also in July of 1990, Iraq publicly demanded that Kuwait pay them $10 billion to make up for the lost revenue from Rumaila. However, Kuwait would scoff at this, counteroffering to send them just a fraction of their demanded sum, $500 million, and nothing more. And so, on August 2nd, 1990, the Gulf War was set in motion as Iraq began to bomb the capital of Kuwait, Kuwait City. Despite the threats from Iraq, Kuwait's military was not prepared for Iraq's incursion, as they had been stood down in mid-July, and many of Kuwait's military personnel had taken a personal leave following the stand-down orders. Furthermore, the invading Iraqi forces greatly outnumbered Kuwait's modest military forces, which, across all branches, numbered less than 20,000 troops, while Iraq's standing military alone numbered nearly 1 million troops strong. The incursion of Iraq's forces swept through Kuwait, and within 12 hours of the beginning of the bombings of Kuwait City, Iraq had seized control of a majority of Kuwait, which prompted Kuwait's royal family to flee the country. After 2 further days of largely one-sided fighting, Iraq's president, Saddam Hussein, declared victory in the country, as the remnants of Kuwait's military personnel were defeated by Iraq's forces or had fled to the neighboring country of Saudi Arabia, and Iraq wasted no time fortifying their positions within the country and amassing a large number of troops along the border with Saudi Arabia. Within hours of Iraq's incursion of Kuwait, the UN Security Council held a meeting that led to Resolution 660 being passed, which condemned the invasion. Further action was then taken by the Council with the passage of Resolutions 661 and 665, which placed economic sanctions on Iraq and a naval blockade to enforce these sanctions, respectively. Naturally, this led to Iraqi leadership publicly lashing out at the UN, refusing to allow foreign nationals to leave the country, holding them as hostages until the sanctions against them were lifted, an offer that was proposed to both the UN Security Council and the United States separately a number of times. However, this offer was repeatedly denied by both entities, who feared that conceding to any of Iraq's demands would ultimately cause further instability in the region. On November 29, 1990, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 678, which formally warned Iraq that if they did not withdraw their troops from Kuwait by January 15, 1991, that its member states would be authorized to use all necessary means, including force, to remove them from the country. The UN Security Council's reasoning for issuing Resolution 678 was twofold, as Kuwait had been a UN member state since 1963, and furthermore, Iraq's expansion was troubling to both the US and European member states that relied heavily on oil from the Middle East, as if Iraq did further expand into Saudi Arabia and managed to take control of the oil fields near the border with Kuwait, Iraq would be in sole possession of a majority of the world's oil reserves. In the days following the announcement of the passage of Resolution 678, Iraq did attempt to strike deals with the Council, similar to their previous offers in nature. However, the UN remained steadfast to rejecting any and all concessions to Iraq, and thus, over the course of December of 1990, a 42-country military coalition was formed to oppose Iraq in what seemed to be an almost inevitable conflict in mid-January of 1991. As the sun set on the evening of January 15, 1991, Iraqi military forces remained in Kuwait as they prepared for the UN's response. It wouldn't take long for the UN to make good on its promise to attempt to remove Iraqi military forces by force, as on the morning of January 16th, UN coalition forces began a series of aerial bombing campaigns against Iraqi infrastructure, targeting both military and civilian infrastructure alike in an effort to weaken Iraq's hold on Kuwait in preparation for an incursion of their own from Saudi Arabia, which marked the beginning of the coalition's offensive and the second phase of the Gulf War, which is often referred to as Operation Desert Storm. The coalition forces' numbers nearly equaled those of the Iraqi military, with just under 1 million troops amongst their ranks, and while both sides were nearly even in their manpower numbers, the coalition's efficient use of their superior firepower would ultimately turn the tides of war against Iraq. In response to the coalition's bombing campaigns, Iraq made good on its previous threats of launching an attack on Israel, who was not a member state of the 42-country coalition opposing Iraq. However, Iraq conducted missile strikes in late January against Israel in an attempt to goad them into retaliatory participation in the war, which threatened to turn the other Arab states who were members of the coalition against the war effort, as they strongly opposed any potential Israeli expansion in the region, and would likely see Israeli intervention in the conflict as a means of their own expansion. On January 29th, Iraqi forces would begin their own counteroffensive against Saudi Arabia and managed to capture the Saudi city of Khafji, which had only maintained light military defenses. However, 2 days following the capture of the city, coalition forces would assist the Saudi military in their efforts to repel the Iraqi forces from Khafji with a heavy artillery barrage on the city, which greatly softened the defensive positioning of the Iraqi forces in the city, and Saudi Arabia was able to retake control of the city. The coalition's efforts on the ground to retake Kuwait from under Iraqi control would begin on February 15, 1991, as US-led troops crossed the border from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait. Over the following few days, the intensity of the conflict flared, as coalition forces began to overwhelm the Iraqis with their offensive capabilities, as the open, flat desert terrain of the region would prove ideal for tank warfare, and the superiority of the coalition's modern tanks' capabilities was put on full display against the comparatively outdated Soviet tanks that resisted them, with the British Challenger 1 tank in particular performing exceedingly well against Iraqi tanks, suffering no losses, but also managed to destroy approximately 300 Iraqi tanks during their combat operations. These large-scale tank battles would serve as a tipping point in the war, as after suffering heavy losses between February 15th and February 24th, Iraqi forces were now on the back foot as coalition forces began their push towards Kuwait City and were faced with little resistance while doing so, as most of the Iraqi forces the coalition encountered had very low morale and quickly surrendered. Kuwait's own military forces were ultimately tasked with retaking Kuwait City themselves, and in a display of just how light the Iraqi resistance against them was by this point, Kuwaiti forces reported that they had suffered one casualty and had a single plane shot down during their recapturing of Kuwait City. 3 days later, on February 27th, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein issued the formal order for his forces to retreat from Kuwait back to Iraq. However, preceding this formal order of retreat, many of Iraq's forces had already begun to withdraw from the region. During their retreat, Iraqi forces followed a scorched earth policy, setting numerous oil wells ablaze as they withdrew towards Iraq, leading to the iconic imagery often associated with the Gulf War of thick pillars of black smoke rising from the desert and darkening the sky above. As a large number of troops withdrew towards Iraq, a long convoy line of vehicles began to form on the main highway that linked the two nations together, Highway 80. For the coalition forces, this presented what they saw as an opportunity, as with a planned offensive into Iraq following the expulsion of Iraqi forces in Kuwait, the large number of military personnel all clustered together in the convoy along Highway 80, should they return to Iraq, would quite literally live to fight another day. The coalition's leadership therefore shifted its focus towards ensuring that as many Iraqi soldiers, and even more strategically importantly, their vehicles, were eliminated as possible before they were able to withdraw completely to Iraq to regroup. On the evening of February 26th, coalition forces set their plan to take advantage of this perceived opportunity into motion when US A-6 intruder jets cluster-bombed both ends of the convoy of vehicles on Highway 80, blocking in the long line of vehicles between them. Throughout the night, over the course of the next 10 hours, US, UK, Canadian, and French jets would continue to rain down destruction on the convoy from above. As the chaos unfolded on the ground, some Iraqi forces would attempt to flee the highway into the desert with their vehicles, many of which were commandeered civilian vehicles. However, they were met by coalition ground forces that had been sent to the area to account for this contingency. As one Iraqi soldier recounted of that fateful night, quote, "There were hundreds of cars destroyed, soldiers screaming. It was nighttime as the bombs fell, lighting up charred cars, bodies on the side of the road, and soldiers sprawled on the ground, hit by cluster bombs as they tried to escape from their vehicles. I saw hundreds of soldiers like this, but my main target was to reach Basra. We arrived on foot," he recounted of his harrowing ordeal on the highway. This soldier's account of the incident mirrored many of the convoy survivors, as the US Department of Defense estimated that as many as 80,000 troops may have managed to escape the chaos on Highway 80 and managed to successfully cross back into Iraq across the Euphrates River on foot. As they continued to barrage the convoy along Highway 80, coalition forces shifted their focus towards a highly sought-after target, the Iraqi Republican Guard's 1st Armored Division, which was ahead of the main convoy on Highway 8, which is the continuation of Highway 80 in Iraq. For this engagement, the coalition utilized AH-64 Apache attack helicopters along with a barrage of artillery strikes to eliminate hundreds of further vehicles and personnel along a 50-mile stretch of Highway 8 and the surrounding desert in Iraq over the course of the morning hours of February 27th. In the aftermath of the incident, as the bleak imagery from the airstrikes and the widespread destruction on the highway were released to the public, outrage involving the incident began to mount, as some outside observers would argue that the attack on the convoy was akin to a massacre, since the Iraqi forces had been retreating from Kuwait on Highway 80. Furthermore, the large number of civilian vehicles interspersed with the military vehicles in the wreckage raised questions about civilian deaths as well, as it was reported that a number of pro-Iraqi Kuwaiti refugees were amongst the convoy as well, including women and children. Former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark argued that the attack constituted a war crime and argued that the coalition forces had violated the Third Geneva Convention's Common Article 3, which forbids the killing of soldiers who are out of combat. Further adding to this controversy, it was also reported that U.S. armored vehicles had opened fire on a group of approximately 350 disarmed Iraqi soldiers who were attempting to surrender on Highway 8. However, the U.S. military denied these allegations and pointed out their willingness to accept capturing surrendered troops, as they had taken 2,000 prisoners following the attack on the Highway of Death. Furthermore, they insisted that while a large number of civilian vehicles were present in the convoy, most of them, if not all of them, were commandeered by Iraqi soldiers, and many were packed with items that had been looted from Kuwait City as they had made their hasty retreat. Ultimately, the outcry surrounding the incident was great enough that U.S. President George Bush declared a cessation of hostilities the following day on February 28th, marking the official end of Operation Desert Storm and the Gulf War. The number of people killed along the Highway of Death was never officially made public. Thank you all for watching.